Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to our March of the Penguins, your daily Penguin tour through my Penguin Classics shelf, author by author and book by book. I was originally doing a library tour, just a standard library tour of my library where we would do it a shelf at a time, sometimes half a shelf at a time, and just, you know the drill. You just pull off a book, you talk a bit about it, you put it back, you pull off the next one. And I knew that the Penguin wall, this wall behind me, would be a source of interest. And I thought that I would finish with it, with my library tour in 2019. But the library tour went long. Go figure. And eventually I realized there's no way that I could do that. And then I thought, well, why? These are my favorite books. Why not give them the time and attention that they deserve? So that's what we're doing. We're going through the library one at a time. Or sometimes many books at a time if we're dealing with somebody like Cicero, somebody who's prolific and has lots of volumes in Penguin Classic. And our Penguin Classic today should be one of those authors, if it weren't for what we always refer to in this series as the pitiless ratio. In other words, the horrible ratio of survival of these ancient texts. If we had everything from the ancient world, if we could go back to the Ulpian library, go back to Trajan's library. The Roman Emperor Trajan constructed a gigantic library. He exercised eminent domain at the base of one of Rome's hills. Bought out all the tenements, bought out all the businesses. It wasn't as heartless as American eminent domain. He was an enlightened emperor. He had an enormous amount of money, so he treated those contracts very well, very fairly. Nobody was put out on the street. Everyone was taken care of. Everyone was glad to go. Even the people who loved their homes got a generous enough settlement so that they could go elsewhere. And then he bulldozed the ancient equivalent of bulldozed that whole area, and made an unbelievably gorgeous two-wing library that had wooded and shady walkways. It had outdoor tables and settings for food. It had the very nicest vendors. Nobody hawking horrible, greasy crap. Nobody yelling bawdy lyrics. No, nothing like that on the grounds of the library. Instead, it was nice. Vendors of food and wine. There were wonderful walkways outside. There were wonderful grassy grounds. There was a gigantic column in the middle that portrayed in bas-relief all the way around it basically Trajan's reign up until that point. All kinds of military endeavors, all kinds of fantastic detail work. And the neat thing about the column was that you had to go into the library to enjoy it because it was so tall. So the library was two wings, and there were windows and walkways all the way around, so that you could, the higher up you went in the two wings, the more of Trajan's column you could see. You could follow the whole story, and the two wings reflect Trajan's somewhat simplistic way of looking at the world. One wing was Latin literature, and the other was Greek literature. So if you were in the Greek wing and you were reading, Silius Italicus or some if you were reading some Greek historian and they mentioned some Roman historian, you had to go all the way to the other building to figure out what that was or to chase that down. But it was a beautiful, beautiful, big, bright, airy rooms, the best in trained attendance for the works, just a gorgeous public library. If we had that library's contents, that library had everything. I know that the Library of Alexandria gets all of the legendary attention, but there were lots of gigantic libraries in the ancient world. This was a marquee one, and it had everything. So if you went into Trajan's library, you would have as many of the plays of Sophocles as still survive, probably all of them. You would have all of the Roman historians, all the Roman memoirists, all the Roman letter writers, all the collections. You would have collections, annals of the Roman Senate's acta. The Roman Senate had a kind of a bulletin. Started out very informal, then it became far more formal, far more detailed. You would have all of that, the equivalent of a newspaper. If we could go back into that library, the author that we're looking at today would have that many volumes, and I would, in a perfect world, I would be holding up an armload of them from Penguin Classics. That author is Pliny the Elder. And unfortunately, thanks to the pitiless ratio that we've been talking about, that isn't the case. He wrote all of his life. One kind of thing or another, he wrote all of his life. He wrote a very colorful and moving biography of an old friend of his, was probably his patron. He wrote a multi-volume history of Rome's wars in Germany. It was, by all accounts, incredible. He wrote all sorts of work on grammar and horsemanship and siege warfare, and he collected all of his letters and sent and annotated them and wrote. He wrote all the time. He had graphomania. He wrote all the time. He outsourced his graphomania just a bit, as his nephew Pliny the Younger tells us a little bit about his uncle, and from that we can glean that Pliny the Elder trained a cadre of very intelligent house slaves to take dictation, very specific and very rapid fire, detailed dictation. So he was writing all the time and had a large number of books, including, heartbreakingly, a multi-volume history of Rome, starting with, I think, around Caligula or Claudius, starting around there and moving on in granular detail. And it's all gone. It's all gone. None of it survived. Only one of his books survived, and it's this one. The natural history was his sort of key to all mythologies. It was kind of his view of the state of what we know today in terms of the natural sciences. And so, as even this brief description of his oeuvre will immediately lead you to know, the book of his that survived is, although a curiosity, it's the one we would least want to survive of all the ones. All the other ones that he wrote couldn't be as wrong or as irrelevant as this book. This book survived. His huge, large chunks of it did. This Penguin Classic is translated by John Healy, and it is not the whole of the natural history. That would be a longer book. I don't think the whole of the natural history has ever been translated in English, other than the Loeb Classical Library edition, which is English on one side and Latin on the other. It'd be nice if somebody did, but it'd only be nice to a certain degree. This is not an inherently very interesting book. Pliny the Elder was deeply interested in the natural world. All kinds of things interested him. He had a great big house in Rome. He had a couple of great big country villas, and including one on the Bay of Naples when he was stationed at the Bay of Naples as the director of the Roman fleet at Misenum. And despite the fact that he was a grandee and he had grandees to his table, and traveled around with a bodyguard, despite that fact, every single villager anywhere around him for 40 years knew that if a calf was born with two heads, he wanted to see it. If God forbid, a child was born with two heads, he wanted to see it. He didn't want to see its dead body. He wanted to be informed right away. He wanted to see it while it was still alive, and he would bring a slave, and the slave would take notes. So things like that fascinated him, and there were all kinds of things like that. There are today all kinds of things like that. So that if a local baby in a village down the hill from his villa was born with its heart outside its chest, and the heart is beating, and the baby's alive and crying, but you know the baby's not going to live, he wanted to see that and observe it. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't heartless. He was conscientious and a kind man, and he had, like his nephew, passed on to his nephew, an absolutely infallible sense of political survival. He knew when to go to earth when the politics of the emperors at Rome shifted from tolerant to intolerant. He knew when to disappear into a villa and just write about beekeeping. He knew when to do that infallibly, and that, as a result, he reached a ripe old age and as a prominent public intellectual. That's what we would call him today, a prominent writer and public intellectual. And he wrote all the time because he had graphomania, yes. He could not have a thought without writing it down or having it written down. But also because he knew the immortality of the written word. That's at least what he thought. We have seen in this Daily Penguin collection that there's no guarantee. There's no guarantee whatsoever. Your work could die, and the works of great writers, the poet Calvus, the historian Asinius Pollio, have died, even though they were extremely voluminous and copied 6 days a week. It still didn't matter. And so it would have struck Pliny the Elder as maybe suitably ironic that his own claim to immortality doesn't have anything to do with this book or any of his other books. It has to do with the disaster that claimed his life, the eruption of Vesuvius in AD 79. happened when he was stationed at Misenum, when he was in charge of the Roman fleet and therefore in charge of Roman citizens, the safety of Roman citizens. He would have been just as in charge of their safety if a vicious pirate fleet had sailed into the bay, as he would have been if, as in this case, a volcano erupted. And he's famous for dying at and of the eruption of Vesuvius, because he landed a small boat on the shore, on the volcano shore. He noticed the eruption from the other side of the bay, immediately headed into the face of danger with his fleet, and landed a small boat on the shore and was overcome by the fumes and just collapsed. The later reports, there could be apocryphal, but there might not be. Later reports said that it looked like he was just sleeping. There was no sign of rictus or contortion or agony of any kind. It looks like he just literally was overcome by gases and just slumped down onto the sand. And that fact has led people, including, I hate to say it, the translator in this volume, to hint or outright say that he died because he was overly curious about the volcano. That here's a guy. Oh, I've seen it in many fly-by-night, yuck Roman historian. Here are some funny bits about ancient Rome books, over and over again, that he died because he was a tourist. In a funny, Oxford Guide to Tourism or whatever, he's always mentioned as somebody who, as a tourist, who died because he got too close to an erupting volcano. That is not true, and Pliny the Elder would have found it ironic and maybe a little infuriating to be immortal for a detail that isn't true. He was overcome by fumes, yes, but no one, lots of people were. No one could have foreseen that, and he wasn't there to get a closer look at the volcano. That was impossible anyway. The volcano was invisible by that point. It was so shrouded in its own fumes that there was nothing to see. He went to help people. He died trying to help people, trying to get people off that shore. So, it gets a little bit wearisome for me to correct that over and over again. I'm guaranteed, if National Geographic or something, or a review in the London Review of Books or whatever, if an article mentions Pliny the Elder, it's odds on absolute certainty, 95% certain, that they're going to say something wrong about him, that they're going to use that one detail and get it wrong. They're going to say that that instead of fleeing the eruption of Vesuvius, he sailed to the eruption in order to get a better look at it and died as a result of that. That is not true. He was duty bound to do what he did. Plenty of men wouldn't have done it, and we'd be calling them cowards now. He does it now, and he's called a feckless tourist, a clueless scientific observer. But anyway, he's immortal for that, but Penguin nevertheless printed this book. I don't know who their audience would be. Pliny the Elder is not taught in schools, which is the typical justification for a lot of Penguin Classic volumes. But one of the things I love about Penguin Classics is that that's not always the justification. Sometimes they just do it to do it. This translation is very good, but I want to give you an idea of what you'll be getting in this book. I don't believe that any reader in the 21st century could read this for pleasure. Whereas his Roman history, his history of German warfare, could very much be read for pleasure. But this, for instance, is a small taste of the natural history under the heading Olive Oil and its Uses. The natural properties of olive oil provide the body with warmth and protect it against the cold. It cools the head when hot. The Greeks, progenitors of all vices, have diverted the use of olive oil to serve the ends of luxury by making it available in gymnasia. It is known that those in charge of gymnasia have sold oil that has been scraped off bodies for 80,000 sesterces, because the Romans didn't have showers. So you would work up a good old-fashioned sweat at the gymnasium, and then you would be coated in oil by attendants, and then they would use a long, thin metal scraper to scrape that oil off every inch of you, taking dead skin with it. It's a remarkable cleaning experience. It doesn't do anything for the groin or the armpits or anything like that. It's not as thorough as a shower. But that's what's meant here, and Pliny he's railing against the fact that used oil scraped off people's sweaty bodies would then be sold. The majesty of Rome has accorded the olive tree great honor by crowning our cavalry squadrons with wreaths of olive on the Ides of July, and also when celebrating minor triumphs. Athens also crowns its victors at the Olympia with wreaths of wild oil. And it goes on after that for pages more about olive oil. So if you find that kind of thing interesting, you can see, even in that little detail, a bit of Pliny's personality. His personality is all through this book. And also a bit of why people would go hunting and pecking through this book, because there's all sorts of historical details that we get nowhere else. All sorts of minutiae and trivia that Pliny was getting from sources open in front of him that we no longer have. So that is probably what the justification is for why this book is still reprinted and still read. But it doesn't have anything in the way of narrative enjoyment to it. So I wanted to warn you ahead of time. Your Daily Penguin is a recommendation for curiosity's sake, but considering some of the authors that we have seen in this series so far who do carry you along confidently in the palm of their hand, it's difficult to make that kind of recommendation with this particular author, with this particular book. It would be easy to do if random chance had saved one of his other books instead of this one. Well, maybe not on grammar, but even that would be, imagine how valuable that would be to Latinists ever since. The On Grammar talked about incredible minutiae that we don't know. We don't know for sure otherwise. Nothing escaped Pliny's notice, and he wrote about it all. I myself would like to have his Roman history, but to each his own. Probably there are people who would absolutely love this book. The cover is from a Roman fresco. No, I think it's from an Italian fresco. The cover shows Pliny the Elder in his study from a 15th century manuscript. Okay, this is a 15th century manuscript. The back cover says it's from the British Library, but it's probably in Jason Harrigan's collection. So there he is in his library. That is not anything like what he looked like, but that's all right. The one thing that we kind of sort of know about him maybe is that he was fairly fat, but who knows? Who knows? He would probably have written an autobiography and tell us all about it himself, but the pitiless ratio intervenes again in the Daily Penguin. So that is your Daily Penguin for today, Pliny the Elder. And if we're doing Pliny the Elder today, I bet you can guess who we're doing next. You'll see if you're right tomorrow. Thank you, BookTube.